The autumn sun was setting over Pine Grove's busy streets when Mrs. Eleanor Thompson walked out of Greenfield Market, carrying 2 paper bags filled with groceries. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, and she wore a warm cardigan over her dress, the same outfit she'd worn earlier that day while volunteering at the local library. As she carefully placed her groceries in the trunk of her well-maintained blue sedan, she noticed a police cruiser slowly driving past. She didn't think much of it at first. After all, this was one of the safest neighborhoods in town. She'd been shopping at this store every Thursday for the past 15 years, picking up ingredients for her famous Sunday family dinners. Officer Richard Chen watched from his patrol car, his eyes narrowing as he observed Mrs. Thompson getting into her vehicle. He'd been on the force for just 3 years, but he'd already developed a reputation among some of his colleagues for his selective traffic stops. The sight of an elderly black woman in this upscale neighborhood didn't fit what he considered normal for the area. Mrs. Thompson drove exactly as she always did, carefully and by the book. She used her turn signals properly, maintained the speed limit, and came to complete stops at every sign. In her rearview mirror, she noticed the patrol car had been following her for several blocks. Her hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel, a familiar tension creeping into her shoulders. She'd experienced this before, but it never got easier. The red and blue lights suddenly flashed behind her. Mrs. Thompson sighed softly and pulled over to the curb, positioning her car perfectly. She reached for her purse, taking out her license and registration before the officer even approached. 45 years of driving had taught her to be prepared for moments like these. Through her side mirror, she watched Officer Chen approach, his hand resting near his weapon, a detail that didn't escape her notice. She kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, just as she taught her children and grandchildren to do. The autumn breeze carried the sound of rustling leaves and distant traffic as she waited. License and registration, Officer Chen demanded sharply, without any greeting. His flashlight beam swept across her face, then through her car's interior, despite the daylight still being sufficient to see clearly. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over, officer?" Mrs. Thompson's voice was steady and polite, though her heart was beating faster than she'd like to admit. She'd done nothing wrong, and they both knew it. "You made an illegal turn back there," Officer Chen stated flatly, though they both knew she'd made no such turn. A small crowd of shoppers had started to gather on the sidewalk, some pulling out their phones to record the interaction. Mrs. Thompson kept her composure, even as she felt the familiar ache of injustice settling in her chest. She'd raised 3 children to be upstanding citizens, including one who'd chosen to serve their community. She'd spent decades building bridges in this town, working as a high school counselor, organizing community events, and volunteering. Yet here she was, being treated like a criminal for driving home from the grocery store. Little did Officer Chen know that his next actions would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the entire department to its core. As the evening shadows grew longer and the crowd of witnesses continued to gather, what should have been a simple drive home was about to become much more than either of them had anticipated. The evening air grew colder as Officer Chen studied Mrs. Thompson's spotless driving record on his patrol car computer. Unable to find anything suspicious, his frustration seemed to grow. Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson sat patiently in her car, watching more people gather on the sidewalk through her rear-view mirror. Some were shaking their heads, while others held up their phones, recording everything. Officer Chen returned to her window, his stance more aggressive than before. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice carrying an edge that made nearby onlookers exchange worried glances. "Officer," Mrs. Thompson responded calmly, though her hands trembled slightly. "I've shown you my license and registration. Could you please explain why I need to step out of my car?" A young woman on the sidewalk spoke up. "She didn't do anything wrong. We all saw her driving perfectly fine." Others nodded in agreement, but Officer Chen ignored them. "I won't ask again," he said, placing his hand on his holster in a way that made everyone nervous. Exit the vehicle now." Mrs. Thompson thought about her grandson's 10th birthday party she was planning for the weekend. She thought about the grocery bags in her trunk, including the special ingredients for his favorite chocolate cake. Taking a deep breath, she slowly reached for her seatbelt. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Officer Chen barked, causing Mrs. Thompson to freeze mid-motion. The crowd grew larger, and concerned murmurs became louder. An older gentleman stepped forward from the group of onlookers. "This is ridiculous. She's just a grandmother coming from the grocery store." But Officer Chen waved him back with a stern warning. Mrs. Thompson finally managed to unbuckle her seatbelt and step out of her car, her movements deliberately slow and careful. The chilly evening wind rustled her cardigan as she stood, straight-backed and dignified, despite the humiliation of the situation. "You're in a restricted parking zone," Officer Chen claimed, though there were no such signs anywhere in sight. Several people in the crowd called out that he was lying, but he continued as if he couldn't hear them. "Officer," Mrs. Thompson said softly but firmly, "I've been shopping at this store every Thursday for 15 years. There has never been a restricted parking zone here. Please, let's talk about this reasonably." But Officer Chen wasn't interested in reason. He began writing a ticket, his hand moving quickly across the paper, as if he wanted to get it over with. The growing crowd of witnesses continued recording, their presence providing both comfort and concern to Mrs. Thompson. A young mother holding her child's hand stepped closer. "I park here all the time," she called out. "There's no restricted zone. This isn't right." Officer Chen's radio crackled with a dispatcher's voice, but he ignored it, focused instead on Mrs. Thompson. His body language became more tense with each passing moment, each witness's comment, each shake of a head from the gathering crowd. Mrs. Thompson stood quietly, her mind racing, but her exterior calm. She thought about all the times she'd had similar conversations with her children and grandchildren about moments like these. "Keep your dignity," she'd always told them. "Stay calm, stay strong, and remember who you are." The sun had nearly set now, and the street lights were flickering on, casting long shadows across the scene. More patrol cars could be heard in the distance, their sirens growing louder. What had started as a simple trip to the grocery store was about to become something much bigger than anyone could have predicted. In the growing darkness, Mrs. Thompson straightened her cardigan and said a silent prayer, knowing that what happened next would change not just her evening, but the entire community's future. The streetlights cast harsh shadows across the sidewalk as Officer Chen pulled out his handcuffs. The metallic clicks seemed to echo through the evening air, causing the crowd to grow even more restless. Mrs. Thompson's heart sank. She'd had hoped it wouldn't come to this. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Officer Chen commanded, his voice carrying none of the respect one might expect toward an elderly woman. A teenage girl in the crowd called out, "She's old enough to be your grandmother. How can you treat her like this?" Others joined in with similar protests, their phones still recording every moment. Mrs. Thompson's arthritis made it painful to put her hands behind her back, but she complied slowly, maintaining her dignity. "Officer," she said quietly, "these cuffs don't need to be so tight. I have arthritis in my wrists." Officer Chen ignored her request, tightening the cuffs another notch. Mrs. Thompson winced but didn't cry out. She thought about her son, about how proud she was of him for becoming a police officer despite everything she'd experienced. She wondered what he would say when he heard about this. The crowd had grown to about 30 people now. A middle-aged man stepped forward, identifying himself as a local business owner. "I'm calling the station right now," he announced. "This is completely unnecessary." "Stay back," Officer Chen warned, placing his hand on Mrs. Thompson's arm to guide her toward the patrol car. She could feel him trembling slightly. Was it anger or nervousness? She couldn't tell. Mrs. Thompson caught her reflection in the patrol car's window. Her silver hair was coming loose from its neat bun, but her eyes remained steady and determined. She thought about all the times she told her students at the high school to hold their heads high in the face of injustice. Now it was her turn to live those words. "I want to speak to a supervisor," Mrs. Thompson stated clearly, loud enough for the witnesses to hear. "And I want these cuffs loosened. They're cutting off my circulation." A young nurse from the crowd approached cautiously. "Officer," I can see her hands turning purple. "Those cuffs are too tight. Please, let me check her circulation. I'm a registered nurse." "Back up. Everyone back up," Officer Chen shouted, his voice cracking slightly. The situation was clearly spiraling beyond his control. More police sirens could be heard approaching in the distance. Mrs. Thompson's grocery bags still sat in her car's trunk. She thought about the ice cream melting, the frozen peas thawing. Such ordinary concerns in such an extraordinary moment. Someone from the crowd called out that they would make sure her car and groceries were safe. As Officer Chen opened the patrol car's back door, Mrs. Thompson paused. "Young man," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of experience, "I want you to remember this moment. Remember how you chose to treat me today." The crowd had started making phone calls, lots of them. Some were calling the police station, others local news stations. A few were already posting the videos online. Mrs. Thompson could hear snippets of their conversations. "You won't believe what's happening. Right in front of Greenfield Market. She's just a grandmother." Just before Officer Chen could guide her into the car, a young boy's voice cut through the chaos. "But Mom, isn't that Mrs. Thompson, the one who helps at the library?" The question hung in the air, highlighting the absurdity of the situation. Mrs. Thompson carefully lowered herself into the patrol car's backseat, her arthritic knees protesting the awkward angle. As the door closed beside her, she caught glimpses of the crowd through the window. All those phones recording, all those faces filled with concern and anger, all those witnesses to another moment that should never have happened. The patrol car's engine rumbled to life, and as they pulled away from the curb, Mrs. Thompson closed her eyes briefly. She thought about her Sunday family dinners, about her grandchildren, about her son's face when he would inevitably hear about this. What she didn't know was that across town, her son was already receiving the first of many urgent calls about a situation involving his mother. The fluorescent lights at the police station buzzed overhead as Officer Chen led Mrs. Thompson through the building's front entrance. The desk sergeant, a heavy-set man with graying temples, looked up from his computer and frowned at the sight of an elderly woman in handcuffs. Those cuffs still hadn't been loosened, Mrs. Thompson said quietly to the desk sergeant. Her wrists were throbbing now, the pain from her arthritis growing worse with each passing minute. The sergeant's frown deepened as he noticed her hand's discoloration. "Chen, what's the charge here?" the sergeant asked, his tone carrying a note of concern. He'd been working the desk for 20 years, and something about this situation didn't sit right with him. Officer Chen fumbled with his notepad. "Illegal turn, and parking in a restricted zone," he muttered, not meeting the sergeant's eyes. Even to his own ears, the charges sounded hollow. A young officer walking by stopped in her tracks, recognizing Mrs. Thompson from the community center where she volunteered. "Mrs. T. What in the world?" she exclaimed, then quickly composed herself, remembering where she was. The desk sergeant was reading through Officer Chen's hastily written report, his expression growing more troubled with each line. "Where exactly is this restricted zone you're referring to?" he asked, knowing the area well. Before Officer Chen could answer, the station's phones started ringing. All of them. The front desk line, the community liaison line, even the chief's direct line. Videos from the arrest were already spreading online, and the community was responding. "I'd like to make my phone call," Mrs. Thompson stated calmly, still standing straight despite her discomfort. The desk sergeant nodded immediately and gestured to Officer Chen to remove the handcuffs. As the cuffs finally came off, Mrs. Thompson gently rubbed her wrists. A young desk officer quickly brought her a cup of water and a chair, earning a quiet thank you from the dignified woman. The station was getting busier by the minute. More officers were coming in from their shifts, and many of them recognized Mrs. Thompson. She'd been at their community outreach events, had helped organize their youth programs, had even baked cookies for their holiday gatherings. "Ma'am, would you like us to call someone for you?" The desk surgeon asked kindly, already suspecting she had someone specific in mind. Mrs. Thompson smiled slightly for the first time since this ordeal began. "No need," she replied softly. "I have a feeling my son already knows." The phones kept ringing. Officers were huddled in corners, whispering and looking at their phones. The videos from outside the grocery store were spreading fast. Someone mentioned that the local news stations were already picking up the story. Officer Chen stood awkwardly by his desk, paperwork scattered in front of him. He was trying to write up his report, but nothing he wrote seemed to justify what he'd done. The desk surgeon watched him struggle, shaking his head slightly. A new wave of murmuring swept through the station as heavy footsteps approached from the captain's office. The automatic doors swung open, and a tall figure emerged, walking with purposeful strides. Mrs. Thompson didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She recognized those footsteps. She'd heard them running through her house for over 30 years, from little boy to grown man. The station fell silent. Officer Chen looked up from his paperwork, and the color drained from his face. The desk surgeon sat back in his chair, understanding finally dawning in his eyes. The footsteps stopped right behind Mrs. Thompson's chair. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the continuous ringing of phones and the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. "Mom?" The captain's voice broke the silence, filled with a mix of concern, love, and barely contained anger. "Are you okay?" The evening shift at the police station had just become a turning point that would change the department forever. The police station seemed to hold its breath as Captain Thompson knelt beside his mother's chair. His usually crisp uniform was wrinkled. He'd rushed over as soon as he'd seen the videos. He gently took his mother's hands, examining her bruised wrists with a mixture of tenderness and growing anger. "Let me see, Mom," he said softly, the way he used to when he was a little boy, and she would patch up his scraped knees. But now their roles were reversed, and the hurt wasn't from a simple fall. Officer Chen stood frozen by his desk, his report forgotten. He'd heard stories about the captain's mother, how she'd raised him alone after his father passed, how she'd worked 2 jobs to put him through college, how she still volunteered at every community event. But he'd never made the connection. Never imagined that the woman he'd just arrested was. The cuffs were too tight. Mrs. Thompson said quietly to her son, but her voice carried in the silent room. "I told him about my arthritis." The captain stood slowly, his full height impressive in the fluorescent lighting. Every officer in the room could see him struggling to maintain his professional composure. This wasn't just their captain anymore. This was a son seeing his mother's bruised wrists. "Someone get the first aid kit," he ordered, and 3 officers rushed to comply. Turning to the desk surgeon, he asked, "What are the charges?" The surgeon shuffled uncomfortably. Officer Chen reported an illegal turn and parking in a restricted zone near Greenfield Market. Greenfield Market? The captain's voice was dangerously quiet. Where Mom has been shopping every Thursday for 15 years. Where she organized their food drive last month. Officer Chen began to speak. "Sir, I didn't know." "Didn't know what?" The captain interrupted, his voice steady but intense. "Didn't know that elderly women deserve respect. Didn't know that tight handcuffs hurt arthritic wrists. Or didn't know that the person you were profiling was my mother." The room grew even quieter, if that was possible. A young officer returned with the first aid kit, and the captain began carefully tending to his mother's wrists. Mrs. Thompson watched her son's face. She could see the little boy who'd once declared he wanted to be a police officer to help people. now confronting the reality of what some officers actually do. "I'd want Officer Chen's body camera footage," the captain announced. "I want the dashcam footage. I want every video from every witness. And I want Internal Affairs notified immediately." Mrs. Thompson placed her hand on her son's arm. "Remember what I always taught you," she said softly. "Change comes from within the system. Use this moment wisely." Several officers were wiping tears from their eyes. They'd all heard the captain talk about his mother during community meetings, how she'd inspired him to join the force, how she'd taught him about justice and fairness, how she still made him Sunday dinner every week. The captain's phone buzzed constantly, calls from the chief, from the mayor's office, from local news stations. The videos had gone viral. People were demanding answers. Officer Chen had sunk into his chair, the weight of his actions finally hitting him. He looked at Mrs. Thompson, really looked at her for the first time, and saw not just an elderly black woman, but someone's mother, someone's inspiration, someone who had raised a man he deeply respected. "I'm going to have to recuse myself from this investigation," the captain announced to the room. "But make no mistake, this will be thoroughly investigated. Not just this incident, but every traffic stop, every arrest, every complaint. Things are going to change around here." Mrs. Thompson stood up slowly, her dignity intact despite everything. "I should get home," she said. "Those groceries in my car trunk won't last forever." The captain put his arm around his mother's shoulders, and for a moment, everyone could see him not as their commanding officer, but as a son who'd almost failed to protect his mother from the very system he was part of. As they walked toward the door, Mrs. Thompson stopped and turned to Officer Chen. "I'll pray for you," she said simply, "and I hope you learn from this." The automatic doors slid open, and as mother and son walked out together, everyone in the station knew that tomorrow would bring changes none of them could yet imagine. The morning after the incident, the police station buzzed with activity. 2 Internal Affairs investigators sat in a small conference room, their eyes fixed on a large screen playing Officer Chen's body camera footage. The video showed every moment, every harsh word, every dismissive gesture that had seemed so normal to him at the time. Down the hall, Mrs. Thompson sat with a police photographer, documenting the purple bruises that had bloomed around her wrists overnight. She hadn't wanted to come back to the station, but her son had convinced her, not as a police captain, but as the little boy she taught to always stand up for what's right. "Does it hurt when I touch here?" the photographer asked gently, positioning Mrs. Thompson's hand under the bright lights. She nodded slightly, thinking about her Sunday dinner plans. She still needed to get new groceries for her grandson's birthday cake. The waiting area outside was packed with community members who'd shown up to support Mrs. Thompson. The local librarian brought tea in a thermos, the same kind Mrs. Thompson always shared during their Wednesday reading sessions with the kids. A young mother held a handmade card from her daughter, who remembered how Mrs. Thompson had helped her with math homework at the community center. In his office, Captain Thompson reviewed the growing pile of complaints against Officer Chen that had suddenly surfaced. Other officers were finally speaking up about incidents they'd witnessed, but hadn't reported. A young rookie described how Chen had mocked an elderly Asian couple struggling with English during a traffic stop. Another told of watching Chen follow black teenagers through the park for no reason. The captain's secretary appeared at his door. "Sir, the chief wants to see you," and the mayor's office called again. "The video has over 1 million views now." Outside in the parking lot, news vans lined the street. Reporters stood in front of cameras, telling the story of a grandmother's trip to the grocery store that exposed something much darker. Some held up photos of Mrs. Thompson at various community events, reading to children, organizing food drives, helping at police fundraisers. Back in the conference room, the Internal Affairs investigators watched as Officer Chen's body camera captured his own reflection in Mrs. Thompson's car window. They noted how he positioned his hand near his weapon despite her calm demeanor, how he'd ignored her mentions of arthritis, How he tightened the cuffs when she'd asked him to loosen them. "Play that part again," one investigator said, leaning forward. Listen to how his tone changes when she questions the restricted zone claim. In the station's break room, officers gathered in small groups, talking in low voices. Many had worked alongside Chen for years. Some admitted they'd seen signs but hadn't spoken up. Others shared their own stories of watching him profile drivers but staying quiet to avoid causing trouble. A young officer approached Mrs. Thompson as she finished with the photographer. "Ma'am," she said hesitantly, "I was there last month when you brought cookies to our community meeting. You told us about raising your son to be a police officer. I should have spoken up sooner about things I saw." Mrs. Thompson looked at the young officer thoughtfully. "It's never too late to do the right thing," she said softly. "That's what I always taught my son." In the evidence room, technicians carefully downloaded footage from dozens of witnesses' phones. Each video showed a different angle of the incident, but they all told the same story. The technicians noted how the bystanders had instinctively known something was wrong, how they'd started recording, how they'd called for help. As the day wore on, Mrs. Thompson's phone kept buzzing with messages from concerned friends and neighbors. Someone had already restocked her groceries. Another had picked up her grandson's birthday present from the store. The community was rallying around her, turning a moment of injustice into a movement for change. The sun was setting when Captain Thompson finally walked his mother to her car. "You sure you don't want me to drive you home?" he asked, still seeing the faint bruises on her wrists. "I've been driving myself home for longer than you've been alive," she reminded him with a small smile. "Besides, I think you have important work to do here." As Mrs. Thompson drove away, her son watched until her car disappeared around the corner. Then he turned back to the station, ready to begin the hard work of turning this painful incident into lasting change. The Internal Affairs Office had never been so busy. 2 weeks after Mrs. Thompson's arrest, investigators sat surrounded by stacks of files and computer screens showing traffic stop data. What had started as one incident was unraveling into something much bigger. "Look at these numbers," one investigator said, pointing to her screen. Officer Chen made 3 times more stops of minority drivers than any other officer in his district. And the pattern goes back to his first day on the job. The wall of their office was covered with a large map of the city, dotted with colored pins showing traffic stops. The pattern was impossible to miss. Certain neighborhoods, certain streets, certain communities had been targeted again and again. Down in the records room, a clerk who'd worked at the station for 30 years was pulling old complaint files. "I'd remember this one," she muttered, reading a dusty report. A black teenager said Officer Chen followed him for 10 blocks before pulling him over. No ticket was issued, but the boy was late for his college interview. The station's phone lines were still lighting up. People who'd stayed quiet before were finding their voices. An elderly Vietnamese man called to report how Officer Chen had mocked his accent during a traffic stop. A Hispanic mother described how Chen had made her children cry by threatening to call immigration when she couldn't find her registration fast enough. In the break room, officers were having difficult conversations. A veteran cop stood by the coffee machine, speaking quietly to his colleagues. "I saw him hassle those kids at the basketball court last summer," he admitted. "Kept asking them for ID even though they weren't doing anything wrong. I should have said something then." The police chief sat in his office, watching video after video that citizens had submitted. Some were from Officer Chen's incidents, but others showed similar behavior from different officers. Each clip told a story of bias, of assumptions, of power misused. Mrs. Thompson's case had opened a door that couldn't be closed. Other officers started coming forward, sharing what they'd witnessed. A female officer described how Chen had dismissed her concerns about his behavior, telling her to stay in her lane. A rookie admitted he'd been afraid to report Chen's actions, fearing it would hurt his career. The city's newspaper ran a front-page story titled "More Than Just One Traffic Stop." They'd interviewed dozens of people who'd encountered Officer Chen, creating a timeline of incidents that stretched back through his entire career. In the community center where Mrs. Thompson volunteered, people shared their own stories during a town hall meeting. A high school student described being pulled over 3 times in 1 week. A grandmother talked about being afraid to drive her grandkids to school. A business owner explained how he changed his route to work to avoid certain police patrol areas. Back at the station, investigators discovered something troubling in Chen's performance reviews. Previous supervisors had noted concerns about his attitude toward minorities, but the warnings had been buried under paperwork and excuses. A young officer who'd graduated from the academy with Chen finally spoke up. During training, she revealed, he used to make comments about certain neighborhoods, certain people. We all heard it, but nobody wanted to be the one to cause trouble. The investigation spread beyond just one officer. The department's training programs came under scrutiny. Policy manuals were pulled from shelves and examined with fresh eyes. Questions were asked about why warning signs had been ignored for so long. Captain Thompson, though officially removed from the investigation, worked late into each night reviewing department policies. His mother's bruised wrists had become a symbol of everything that needed to change. In the evidence room, technicians created a database of all the footage they'd received. Each video, each complaint, each testimony added to a picture that couldn't be ignored. This wasn't about one officer or one incident. It was about patterns that had gone unchallenged for too long. Mrs. Thompson continued her volunteer work at the library, now often stopping to share her story with others who'd been afraid to speak up. Change, she would tell them, starts with one person brave enough to say, "This isn't right." As the investigation entered its 3rd week, it was clear that Officer Chen's traffic stop of Mrs. Thompson hadn't just exposed one officer's bias. It had cracked open a door that would lead to changes nobody had imagined possible. The police department's largest conference room was packed for Officer Chen's disciplinary hearing. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the faces of everyone present. Mrs. Thompson sat in the front row, her hands folded quietly in her lap, her son the captain seated beside her. The room fell silent as Mrs. Thompson walked to the podium to give her testimony. She didn't bring any notes. She didn't need them. The memory of that evening was still fresh in her mind, from the cold metal of the handcuffs to the fear in the watching crowd's eyes. "I'm not here for revenge," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I'm here because what happened to me happens to others who might not have a police captain for a son, who might not have witnesses with phones, who might not have the strength to speak up." In the back of the room, several community members nodded. They'd all come to support her. The librarian who worked with her, the kids she tutored, the families she'd helped over the years. Each person had a story about Mrs. Thompson's kindness, her dignity, her quiet strength. Officer Chen sat at a table with his union representative, looking smaller somehow in his civilian clothes. He kept his eyes down as Mrs. Thompson described how the handcuffs had aggravated her arthritis, how she'd had to cancel her grandson's birthday party that weekend because her wrists were too sore to bake. The evidence was overwhelming. The Internal Affairs investigation had uncovered a pattern of behavior that couldn't be ignored. Slides showed statistics of Chen's traffic stops, the disproportionate numbers, the questionable citations, the complaints that had gone uninvestigated. A young black teenager testified about being stopped 3 times in 1 month. An elderly Asian couple described being mocked for their accents. A Hispanic mother told how her children now feared police cars. Their stories formed a pattern that stretched back through Chen's entire career. During a break, Mrs. Thompson stood in the hallway, accepting hugs from well-wishers. "You're so brave," they told her, but she just shook her head. "Brave is speaking up when nobody knows your name," she replied. "Brave is being afraid, but doing the right thing anyway." The police chief presented the department's findings. Body camera footage played on large screens, showing incident after incident. The room watched in silence as the evidence mounted. The racial comments, the unnecessary stops, the escalated tensions. When it was Officer Chen's turn to speak, he struggled to find words. "I didn't see it," he said finally. "I didn't see how my actions. I didn't see the people I was hurting." His voice cracked as he looked at Mrs. Thompson. "I didn't see you as someone's mother, someone's friend, someone who helps kids with their homework and bakes cookies for the station." The disciplinary board's decision was unanimous. Officer Chen's badge and gun would be turned in. His certification would be revoked. But more than that, the department announced sweeping changes, new training programs, community oversight committees, regular reviews of traffic stop data. As people filed out of the room, Mrs. Thompson's grandson ran up to hug her. He was wearing his junior police badge, a gift from his uncle, the captain. "Grandma," he whispered, "did you help make things better?" She looked at her son, who was already deep in conversation about implementing the new changes. She looked at the community members who'd found their voices. She looked at the young officers who'd finally spoken up about what they'd seen. "Yes, baby," she said, hugging him close. "I think we all did." Later that evening, as Mrs. Thompson worked in her garden, a young officer stopped by. She was one of the rookies who'd been afraid to report Chen's behavior before. "I want you to know," she said, setting down a plate of cookies, "your courage changed things. We're all training differently now. We're learning to see people, not stereotypes." Mrs. Thompson smiled, thinking of all the changes that had come from one simple trip to the grocery store. Sometimes, she realized, the biggest changes start with the smallest moments. As she watched the sun set over her garden, she said a quiet prayer, not just for justice, but for understanding, for growth, and for the courage to keep speaking up. 6 months had passed since that evening outside Greenfield Market. The police station looked different now, not just because of the new community bulletin board in the lobby, but because of the spirit inside its walls. Mrs. Thompson stood at the podium in the training room, facing a class of new police recruits. Her son, the captain, sat proudly in the back, watching his mother share her story. It had become a required part of their training, not just hearing about what happened, but understanding the human impact of their actions. "When you put on that badge," she told them, her voice warm but firm, "you're not just becoming an officer. You're becoming part of our community. Each person you meet is somebody's mother, somebody's child, somebody's friend." The recruits listened intently. They'd all seen the videos of her arrest, but hearing her speak in person was different. One young officer raised his hand. "How do you not feel angry?" he asked. "How did you turn this into something positive?" Mrs. Thompson smiled gently. "Anger burns you up inside," she explained. "But purpose builds things. And we're building something important here." She was right. The department had changed dramatically. Every traffic stop was now reviewed weekly for patterns of bias. Officers received regular training from community members, learning about different cultures and experiences. The complaint system had been overhauled, making it easier for citizens to report concerns. After the training session, Mrs. Thompson walked through the park where she'd started a community garden project with the police department. Officers and local kids worked together, planting vegetables and flowers. A young girl waved from where she was helping a police officer plant tomatoes. At the community center, the walls displayed photos of recent events. Police officers reading to children at the library, joining neighborhood cleanup days, attending cultural celebrations. Mrs. Thompson's incident had sparked something unexpected. A genuine desire for connection. Her son had implemented Coffee with Cops, sessions where officers sat with community members, not to talk about crime, but to share stories and understand each other better. The latest session had been so crowded they'd had to bring in extra chairs. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story. 6 months later, how one incident changed a city. They interviewed Mrs. Thompson in her kitchen while she baked cookies for the next police training session. "Sometimes," she told them, "it takes a difficult moment to open people's eyes." At the grocery store where it all began, things had changed too. Officers now regularly stopped by to help elderly shoppers with their bags, to chat with the teenagers who hung out nearby, to be part of the community rather than just policing it. The police academy had completely revised its training program. Every new officer now spent time working in community service before ever making a traffic stop. They volunteered at soup kitchens, helped at senior centers, and learned to see the human side of their city. Mrs. Thompson's grandson had started a youth program connecting kids with police officers through sports and activities. "My grandma taught me," he told everyone, "that change starts with understanding each other." Even former Officer Chen had found a way to contribute. After losing his badge, he'd started speaking at police academies across the state, sharing his story as a warning about the dangers of bias and the importance of seeing humanity in every interaction. On Sunday evenings, Mrs. Thompson still hosted her family dinners. But now the table often included officers who'd become part of their extended family. They shared meals, stories, and dreams for their community's future. As she stood in her kitchen that evening, baking cookies for tomorrow's training session, Mrs. Thompson thought about how far they'd come. The bruises on her wrists had long since faded, but the changes they'd inspired would last for generations. "Mom," her son called from the living room, "the new Community Oversight Committee wants you to chair their first meeting next week." Mrs. Thompson smiled as she slid another tray of cookies into the oven. Sometimes, the worst moments in life led to the best changes. She'd taught her children that lesson years ago, and now she'd helped an entire police department learn it too. Outside her window, a police car drove slowly past her house. The officer inside waved warmly, and Mrs. Thompson waved back. This was what real change looked like. Not just new policies and procedures, but transformed hearts and minds, one person at a time.